Welcome to the 17th Annual State of Indian Nations. We are so happy you could join us today, here in the night studio at the Newseum in Washington, D.C. Ani Buju Biwakajing Dishnakas. My name is Aaron Payment. I am the chairperson of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa Indians and the first vice president of the National Congress of American Indians, the oldest, largest, and most representative American Indian and Alaska Native organization serving the broad interests of tribal governments and communities. As part of our effort to further the goals of Indian country, NCI brings together tribal leaders, government officials, and members of Congress to discuss challenges, opportunities, and solutions to issues faced by communities. And that is what it is all about today. We have a full house today of our tribal leaders, senior federal officials, students, organizational partners, and some of the strongest allies who are dedicated to working together on the issues facing Indian country. We thank the Piscataway people for allowing us to be on your lands today. I want to welcome each of you who are attending the State of Indian Nations in person and give our thanks to the thousands of people who are watching and listening to this event over all across the country and across the world. Watch parties have been organized across the nations to join the live stream, and this year we have more watch parties than ever before. I want to thank and welcome our partners from the Congress and from the administration who are here with us today. We are also joined today by my colleagues and our members of the NCI Executive Committee who represent all regions across the nation. Let's hear it for our vice presidents. I also want to recognize our future leaders here in Washington, D.C. by welcoming the students from many colleges and educational programs. And we extend our thanks to Congresswoman Deborah Holland, who will be joining us to provide our congressional response today. If you are posting on social media about the State of Indian Nations today, please use our hashtag SOIN2019. We can capture and answer questions using this hashtag, so send your questions our way. It's now my pleasure to introduce the 22nd President of the National Congress of American Indians, Jefferson Keel, to deliver the State of Indian Nations address. President Keel was first elected as president of NCI from October 2019 to 2013. He was re-elected as NCI's president in October 2017. Jefferson Keel is serving his 5th term as Lieutenant Governor of the unconquerable Chickasaw Nation. President Keel is a living example of the honorable public service. He's a former airborne ranger and Army officer serving over 20 years of active duty. He represents Indian country on numerous boards and committees and is a tireless and fearless warrior for tribal sovereignty. Please join me in welcoming our NCI President Jefferson Keel.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Chugwa shke slaka. Ashmomaka slaka. That means good morning, greetings. Thank you for coming. It's good that you're here, and I'm happy that you're here. I'm glad to see you. I thank Abba Beniling, or God, for bringing us together in a good way for this historic dialogue between Indian country and the United States. On behalf of the 573 federally recognized tribes and dozens of state-recognized tribal nations and millions of Native people across this land, I welcome you, distinguished guests, those watching around the globe, to the 17th Annual State of Indian Nations Address. I'm humbled to deliver this address. I consider it a great honor to serve Indian country in this way. I was also blessed to preside over our annual conference last October, where NCAI launched its 75th anniversary, the year as a difference-making organization protecting tribal sovereignty and advancing tribal priorities. I stand here today to proudly proclaim to you, Congress, the administration, and the world, the State of Indian Nations is strong, and we grow stronger. We grow stronger every day. From our cultures and languages to our economies and political power, tribal nations are crafting a great resurgence that is forging brighter futures for our communities and generations yet to come. Despite facing strong headwinds and resistance, we are elevating our presence and voice in this country's public and policy discourse at a time when it's most needed. We're claiming our rightful place as the original pieces in the mosaic of America, and our rightful role as key contributors in the charting of its future course. The signs of our resurgence are everywhere. They're seen in sports and the arts, where increasingly we're sharing our stories and identities with mainstream society. From actor Wes Studi speaking his Cherokee language to the world at last year's Oscars, to Onondaga lacrosse star Lyle Thompson turning an ugly display of racism into a teachable moment about dignity, empathy, and cultural pride. They're seen in expressions of respect for Native people by those who mold America's youth. From the state of Florida, honoring Joy Prescott, a Seminole immersion school teacher, as Teacher of the Year, to Little League International's decision to ban race-based mascots from all sanctioned competition. Our resilience is seen in tribal nations' building of robust economies, which provide jobs and families, economic security to hundreds of thousands of Native people, and tens of thousands of non-Native people. Indian country has a long way to go, but in more and more places, we are becoming the primary drivers of economic growth, fostering a better quality of life for all. Our unity is seen in our growing alliances, powerfully displayed in recent legal briefs defending the Indian Child Welfare Act. They saw 325 tribal nations, 57 Native organizations, 31 child welfare organizations, 21 states, several members of Congress, and other partners join forces to keep Native children immersed in their tribal families, cultures, languages, and communities. Our strength is heard. Our strength is heard in the enduring power of our songs, prayers of tolerance, and humility, sung with a good mind and enlightening purpose in the face of ignorance and arrogance. It is seen in the midterm elections in North Dakota, New Mexico, Minnesota, and elsewhere. Native people, understanding the stakes, turned out to the polls like never before, despite determined efforts to keep us away. In many places, we were the margin of victory, showing we are a political force to be reckoned with. And our resurgence is seen in the record number of Native candidates who ran for federal, state, and local offices and won. Yes, absolutely. On election night, I rose to applaud Peggy Flanagan, who, as Minnesota's new lieutenant governor, becomes the highest-ranking Native woman elected to executive office in the United States. Like many of you, my spirit was stirred by Ruth Buffalo, who took the oath of office in North Dakota in her traditional regalia, honoring her ancestors. Ruth's victory was pure, poetic justice, as she upset the state legislator who sponsored the bill to suppress Native voters by making them show IDs with residential street addresses. And in our nation's capital, I was deeply moved by the first two Native congresswomen in U.S. history, Deb Haaland and Sharice Davids. At their swearing in, embracing in a moment of solemn reflection about their historic achievement and all who sacrificed to make it possible. They joined Tom Cole and Mark Wayne Mullen to give Indian country its largest congressional delegation ever. Casual observers of Indian country's resurgence may deem it an overnight phenomenon. Nothing could be further from the truth. Our success flows from the foresight and counsel of our ancestors. It's driven by the core values and relentless spirit that have sustained our societies and cultures for millennia. It grows today thanks to the decades of planning, preparation, and hard work of so many tribal leaders, elders, advocates, youth, everyday tribal citizens, native vote coordinators, and our ever-expanding network of partners and allies. Long before Wes Studi and Lyle Thompson came along, there was Chickasaw storyteller Teyata, Osage ballerina Maria Tallchief, and Santee Dakota philosopher John Trudell, who showed the world that only Native people can truly define their own humanity and speak their own truths. And before Deb Howland and Sharice Davids rose to this moment, there was Elizabeth Peradovich, a well-known Tlingit civil rights leader, Ada Deer, a Menominee, who served as Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs and ran for Congress, and Denise Juneau from Fort Berthold, who became the first Native woman elected to statewide office in Montana. These leaders and many others cleared the paths for Deb and Sharice to follow. The truth is, we've always been strategic planners and shrewd actors who adapt to and overcome the great challenges before us. Today, as the first distinct indigenous peoples of this land, we perpetuate our time-honored tradition of applying lessons learned from a closely held past to confront threats to our continued resurgence, ensuring our enduring vibrancy. Indian country owes our resurgence to tribal sovereignty and self-determination, the inherent authority, strength, and wisdom to ably tackle the great challenges of our time, just like our ancestors did before. Tribal leaders gathered 75 years ago to celebrate and create the National Congress of American Indians to respond to the greatest threat of their time, the federal policy of terminating tribal governments. Through tireless struggle, Indian country overcame that threat, and in the decades since, NCAI has spearheaded tribal nations' efforts to fend off the gravest threats of our right and ability to govern our lands, citizens, and affairs, and relationships as we see fit, from safeguarding the civil rights of Native people and to protecting where and how we practice our spirituality. NCAI continues to answer that call, for the threats we face today are just as daunting. Take the recent government shutdown, the longest that this nation's ever had. This pointless crisis wreaked financial havoc on millions of Americans, including a disproportionate number of Native people. It represented a gross dereliction of duty by our leaders in Washington, who are sworn to uphold the federal government's legally mandated trust and treaty obligations to tribal nations by providing adequate, stable funding for programs that serve our people. The shutdown cut particularly deep across Indian country, disrupting access to vital services like health care, housing, and food distribution, and endangering public safety from unplowed snow-covered roads to unsupported children at high risk. It also meant opportunities lost. The Quinault Indian Nation, for example, lost a $1.4 million timber sale during the shutdown just because it couldn't get a signature from the feds. Yet, like we've always done, tribal nations rose to meet a challenge not of their own making. Many found creative ways to stretch their limited financial reserves to ensure employees supported by federal dollars could keep receiving a paycheck. Others deployed innovative measures to help their citizens and other local residents make ends meet. The Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma, for example, kicked in its own money and established a GoFundMe page to provide groceries to those furloughed or working without pay. The Mescalero Apache tribe in New Mexico offered affected workers jobs at its businesses. The Shoshone-Bannock tribes in Idaho culled from its bison herd to provide meat to workers unable to buy food for their families. And the Navajo Nation's Utility Authority allowed furloughed employees to delay paying their bills until after the shutdown's end. Tribal nations took these steps because, as responsible governments, we take care of our communities, no matter what. We certainly don't manufacture crises to avoid doing so. And with it likely to take months, perhaps years, for us to fully recover from this shutdown, Indian country cannot afford, and America should not stand for another one. And no leader of the federal government should stand for it either. Each took an oath to protect the U.S. Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. That solemn oath is to this country, not a party or an individual. If there's to be another shutdown, it should include the salaries and health care of everyone in Congress and the White House. Indian country faces another daunting threat in the administration's effort to undercut the regulatory framework by which tribal nations place land into trust. The Department of the Interior cannot be allowed to simply make it up as it goes along when deciding whether to take land into trust for tribal nations, ignoring decades of established precedents in the process. The Department's recent about-face in rejecting the Mashpee Wampanoag placement of traditional homelands into trust is especially troubling. If left to stand, it threatens to create a class system of haves and have-nots among tribal nations. Some tribal nations will be able to take newly acquired land into trust to protect sacred places. Others will not. Some will be able to regrow their land bases to empower economic growth. Others will not. They will be subject to the whim and conflicted interests of whoever's running the interior at the moment. This not only ignores the Indian Reorganization Act's mandate of tribal self-determination, it is patently and arbitrarily unfair. We demand Interior rescind its Mashpee decision and recommit its earlier precedent regarding land into trust applications under the 2014 Certiorari M opinion. We also call on the Department of the Interior solicitor to reinstate the Alaska M opinion, which affirms the Secretary's authority to place land into trust to benefit tribal governments in Alaska. The federal government's policy for tribal lands needs to put the interests of tribal nations first and no one else's. Equally concerning to Indian country is the rushed and ill-conceived reorganization of the Department of the Interior and the Bureau of Indian Affairs, done largely without tribal input and against our declared wishes. This effort has featured alarming changes made with no consultation or explanation. For example, the abrupt Thursday night massacre saw vital, high-level administrators across the Bureau of Indian Affairs reassigned to distant places to work on issues with tribal communities they had little experience with. This left several regions without a permanent regional director for months on end, handicapping the Bureau's ability to serve tribal nations on the government's behalf. This reorganization threatens to diminish the authority of the BIA, the regional directors within Interior's overall structure, and seeks to isolate the BIA from other agencies at the Interior. This, in turn, will isolate and weaken the programs and services that those agencies provide Indian country. NCAI reiterates our call to the administration to halt the Interior and BIA reorganizations so it can assess their negative impacts on tribal communities and then integrate tribal priorities into a revamped restructuring plan. We also demand Interior heed the call of Indian country in Congress by creating an undersecretary for Indian Affairs so that our priorities can get their just due. Another grave threat impacting not just Indian country, but the entire planet, is climate change. The science is settled, the evidence undeniable. Our world is gravely ill. Human beings are the cause, and only we can administer the cure. Climate change threatens our well-being, places, and ways of life in every conceivable way. And by all accounts, Indian country is feeling the wrath sooner and worse than other populations. From Shishmaref in Alaska to Isle de Jean Charles in Louisiana to Tohola Village in Washington, hundreds of tribal communities are losing homes to waters rising from global warming. Many tribal nations are relocating entire communities before they're lost for good. Climate change also erodes our ability to exercise our inherent and treaty-reserved rights to hunt and fish by ravaging our subsistence resources and their life-giving habitats. Pervasive droughts caused by changing weather patterns constrict our ability to harvest traditional foods, medicines, while our sacred sites grow ever more and more vulnerable to wildfires, flooding, and erosion. And as the administration's National Climate Assessment explains, tribal economies, which depend on our self-determined management of water, land, natural resources, and infrastructure, are being impacted by changes in climate. Tribal nations have long understood Mother Earth's delicate balance and the sacred charge we have to nourish her as she does us. We've developed finely tuned management practices to steward the natural world so that it could continue nurturing all living things, from controlled burns to reduce wildfire damage, to water conservation strategies to offset prolonged droughts. Despite significant legal and policy barriers that complicate our efforts to carry out this hallowed commitment to stewardship, tribal nations are leading. From Blue Lake Rancheria in California to the Passamaquoddy tribe in Maine to the native village of Kotzebue in Alaska, we're developing climate action solutions and coalitions that provide common sense blueprints for the world to follow. NCAI supports tribal nations' climate action efforts, from advancing their consensus priorities at the UN to advocating for tribal water settlements in an age of ever-increasing water scarcity. We're leading on climate action because we recognize future generations will either revere us for our bold initiative in this moment or condemn us for the doomed planet that we've left them. Simply put, we can no longer afford deniers. We need doers. Doers committed. We need doers committed to working together as one to save our planet for all. We need the United States government to lead with us. Yet today we find that government broken. The shutdown is a sobering reminder of the failed state of our partisan politics. Given climate change and the other monumental challenges this country faces, America can no longer afford a government fixated on settling political scores and pandering to corporate interests. Indian country certainly cannot. We must cleanse our governance of the politics of racism and fear, and the rhetoric of winners and losers, false narratives about zero-sum economics that fuel inequality, and all else that divides us. Our leaders in Congress and the administration must come together to place the fate of our children and our grandchildren, including Native children, those brown ones, ahead of rigid dogma in their own campaign coffers. We must and will hold them to that standard. While considered by some a lost art, bipartisanship is the only proven path to meeting this nation's challenges. The recent Farm Bill is a prime example of the good that comes to all when our leaders put nation before party. The Farm Bill and recent tribal energy legislation also affirm Indian country's issues are not partisan issues. They are America's issues. They transcend political party. Every member of Congress and the administration has a duty to faithfully execute the government's legally mandated trust and treaty responsibilities to tribal nations, no matter who voted for them on Election Day. In 2019, performing that duty means avoiding another shutdown, fully repairing the damage the last one caused, including doing right, not just by federal employees, but by federal contractors who serve Indian country, and authorizing advance appropriations for the BIA and Indian Health Service. So that we're insulated against partisan gridlock from here on out. As fellow tribal leader Aaron Payment said during the shutdown, we prepaid in full with our lands for federal programs and services, and now the government's mortgage payment is due. From now on, we want that payment guaranteed on time, every time. Performing that duty to uphold the federal trust and responsibilities also means enacting a clean Carcieri fix to bring long overdue certainty to the land and the trust process. Stemming the tide of violence against Native women by strengthening the Violence Against Women Act. Passing Savannah's Act and including tribal nations in Victims of Crime Act funding, and protecting the Indian Child Welfare Act. For our Native families, have suffered the agony of having our children ripped from us for far too long, an agony that sadly indigenous migrant families along our southern border now share with us. Performing that duty also means ending the assault on our unique political status, notably allowing states to interfere in tribal provision of Medicaid services. Investing substantially in tribal infrastructure on tribal terms. Passing the Indian Community Economic Enhancement Act and Native American Business Incubators Act, which will strengthen our ability to build diversified economies. Properly implementing the Farm Bill and the 477 Workforce Development Act. Combating the growing number of hate crimes against Native people. Ensuring a complete count of Native people in Census 2020. And repairing the broken promises report by the United States Commission on Civil Rights by fully funding the federal government's trust responsibility. Finally, performing that duty means committing to appointing federal judges who understand and respect the unique political and legal status of tribal nations. Confirming a permanent Indian Health Service director when we've been without one for 4 years, which is outrageous. You know, and ensuring that the Interior Secretary doesn't just pay lip service to tribal sovereignty, but upholds it in practice. The federal government's trust responsibility is not discretionary. In closing, to the United States government, I promise that NCAI will be there every step of the way, partnering with you and holding you accountable, just as we have since 1944. To our elected leaders and the American people, I invite you to become Indian country's allies. Learn from us about our histories, governments, and contemporary life. Engage with us to understand what respect for Native people entails and how you can help us achieve our goals for thriving cultures and communities. To Indian country, I remind you that the National Congress of American Indians is your D.C. watchdog. We have your back in protecting tribal sovereignty and fighting for your priorities. Always have, always will. To tribal leaders, I implore you, now more than ever, NCAI needs your voices your guidance, your wisdom, your partnership, and your help if we're to collectively forge our chosen pathways to vibrant futures. Our people can afford no less in this time of great uncertainty and great opportunity. May God bless all of you, and may God bless Indian country. Chigmaski. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, President Keogh, for that important message on the strength of tribal nations and the need for unity and cooperation as we work to advance the needs of our people. And as one very wise Chickasaw said, it's a trust thing. We have invited a member of Congress to provide a congressional response to the State of Indian Nations address. This year, we are pleased to be joined by Congresswoman Deborah Haaland. Deborah Haaland is an enrolled member of Laguna Pueblo, and she made history in 2018 midterm elections as one of the first Native American women elected to Congress. Congresswoman Haaland now serves as the Vice Chair of the House Natural Resources Committee and as the Co-Chair of the House Native American Caucus. And on a personal note, I have to tell you, on the primary day, I cried, and on general election, I cried. And so we would like to welcome you to the stage. Congresswoman Haaland.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Thank you all. That was so kind of you. Guwatsi Hopa Duhinome Etzartuitza Shumi Hanu. My name is Deborah Haaland, and I am the Congresswoman for New Mexico's 1st District. Thank you, President Jefferson Keel, for that amazing speech, your fierce leadership, and words of wisdom and truth. And thank you so much for the invitation today. I'm so honored to be here. And thank you, NCAI First Vice President and Chairman Dr. Aaron Payment, for your kind introduction and for your outspoken nature on the issues that concern all of Indian country. So thank you all. We are standing on Indian land, and I thank all of the ancestors for allowing me a voice in this space today. This year marks the first time in history that Native American women have had congressional representation. I am deeply honored to have been elected, and I carry a great weight of responsibility to uphold the integrity of my position, to help move communities forward so we will continue to be proud of who we are and where we come from. We have an opportunity to change our narrative, to weave ourselves a story moving forward in the fabric of America with our own art and tools. Stories that have been authored by those outside of our communities, often without our consent, that have been inadvertently absorbed as the truth about who we are as people, what we should believe about ourselves, and the false depictions of our heritage and history no longer have to be read. I am an enrolled member of the Pueblo of Laguna, one of 19 pueblos located in New Mexico and one of 23 separate Native nations. While each of our 23 sovereign governments' traditions, beliefs, and politics differ from one another, many of us share a tradition that has been passed down from our spirits to our elders that has carried our stories and prayers into the present day. Collectively, Indigenous people share the gift of weaving as a practice that has provided us the skills that aided our survival and brought beauty into our communities. Weaving teaches us discipline, self-control, and patience in the process of creating a larger product to share that is also utilitarian. The stories that are told to us as children are woven into our baskets, rugs, and blankets and exchanged across space and time. These weavings explain where we came from and who we are. Our secrets are preserved in the practice, handed down to each successive generation. We have the privilege of knowing our past, and so our children can continue to create patterns of their own. Although our weavings tell stories that are not written, they are authored by us and illustrate a story that tells us that our people are survivors and that we are resilient. From blankets laced with smallpox to long walks and trails of tears leading to death camps and winter massacres at Wounded Knee, our blankets kept us warm, and those who lived told a story of our family's survival of genocide, drought, and famine. From assimilation to mass reductions of our livestock to trading post exploitation of Native American culture and labor, our rugs provided us with economic opportunities to tell a story of our continued rise out of mass poverty and our entrepreneurial spirit. From lack of access to running water and isolated reservation lands where our people were sent to die, our baskets carried water and food to tell us a story of resilience and strength. Multiple times throughout history, others have tried to reshape our story of strength and resilience, like boarding schools that tried to beat the story from our grandparents' memory, stealing our languages in an attempt to kill the Indian and save the man. Our families have carried the psychological devastation of the federal government's failed policies. However, our families also continue to hand down our blankets, baskets, and rugs that contain our stories of strength that move us forward and give us hope. In recent times, that hope has been compromised by a president who fails to acknowledge our nation's history, and in the process, he fails to live up to the trust obligations of the U.S. government. His ignorant and tone-deaf statements illustrate that our voices have been lost or minimized in national dialogues because we have largely been without Native American representation. Today, one issue I'd like to highlight is the suicide crisis with our Native youth, the second leading cause of death among Native American youth between the ages of 10 and 24, severely exceeding the national average. Our children are far more valuable to communities than this. It is our responsibility as leaders to blend the power of our voices together to help our children know their history so they can be proud of that inheritance and know their obligation to carry it on. For me, our collective voice was apparent when I witnessed its power at Standing Rock. This marked a point in modern history where our people's voices proved that we could have political power and national support. There I witnessed the strength and resilience that our communities have maintained through time. In the past, even though corrosive federal policies have tried to eradicate our people, we are still here. Even though blatant racist depictions of our culture remain memorialized in disposable sports memorabilia, we remain strong. Even though the president's despicable remarks remain unapologetically immortalized on internet platforms that more than 90% of our citizens don't have access to, we remain unfazed. This is because patience and self-control were skills that got our ancestors through the worst of days. And while we can never forget the devastation of what we have endured in the past, just like we will not forget to bring our blankets, rugs, and baskets with us, no matter where we go, we will weave beauty into our environments with new patterns to create new designs for our people as we have been taught to do. This is why, at the State of the Union address last week, I took my own blanket to save my seat, because that is who we are, and to reshape the national narrative through our own voice, we must rethink how we represent ourselves in the larger picture. Part of redefining who we are starts at home. Last week at the University of New Mexico, the first major public discussion of Pueblo feminism took place during the 20th Annual American Indian Studies Association Conference. During a panel, students described the presence of women and two-spirit people in modern tribal governance. One of the female students said, quote, "I am never going to be a governor or hold a leadership position in my tribe because these are only positions reserved for males." This is probably why Deb Haaland ran for Congress, because she knew she couldn't have political power within our existing system, unquote. I ask, is this the message that we should pass down to our youth? Some tribes continue to practice a European tradition of patriarchal governments that refuse to allow women a seat at the table. As another one of these bright young women said, we are survivors of colonialism, but we don't have to continue to live in it. To the students who organize this discussion to shed light on the issue, thank you for your bravery and your strength. Your leadership is what keeps me moving forward. I see you and I hear you. The crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous and violence against women cannot be overlooked any longer. On the federal level, I am working to provide resources for those who have continually been at the losing end of funding and advocacy. I appreciate the recent work that tribal governments have done to shed light on the silent crisis of gender violence and violence against our women that have gone overlooked in Indian country for far too long. Most of all, I thank the Native women who have endured generations of systematic violence, who are 10 times more likely to be murdered and 4 times more likely to be sexually assaulted when compared to the national average. In 2016, it was reported that 8 in 10 Native women had survived serious violence during their lifetimes. 50% have suffered sexual violence, and 90% of these cases have involved a non-Native perpetrator. Further exacerbating this issue, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Broken Promises report states that crime and victimization in Indian country is caused by the systematic underfunding of tribal law enforcement and criminal justice systems, coupled with pre-existing barriers. In communities with the nation's highest rates of crime that are comparable to dense urban cities like Detroit and Los Angeles, I'm building on legislation like Savannah's Act and VAWA to provide our women with programmatic resources that will expand to urban areas where many Native Americans are frequently overlooked in this silent crisis. My work will also provide resources to families of missing women. We continued to make history last month, not the history that we like to make, with the longest government shutdown in United States history that stretched into an unnecessary 35-day-long period. As we know, these shutdowns significantly and disproportionately impact tribal nations by cutting off federal funding for public safety, healthcare services, and food distribution programs. I heard from numerous tribes struggling with the lack of access to their federal funding that is obligated by our nation's trust responsibility to tribes. Accounts were significantly depleted, and in some cases, tribes were unable to receive drawdown funds from the Interior because administrative staff had been deemed non-essential. During the shutdown, federal and tribal employees found themselves choosing between food and medicine. This is why I co-introduced 2 pieces of legislation on Friday to provide advanced appropriations for basic services in Indian country. These bills will ensure that, number 1, the delivery of health care and public safety services are available for Native Americans during future government shutdowns, and 2, Indian health care providers can pay their employees. I am also working on drafting a comprehensive response to the Broken Promises report so that the federal government lives up to its trust responsibilities. I expect to have draft language in the coming months and will absolutely ask for your input. As we see, many of the environmental issues in Indian country currently faces are woven together. Last week, after significant pressure from our Natural Resources Committee, the New Mexico delegation and tribes, BLM's New Mexico State Office pulled back 9 land parcels scheduled for the March oil and gas lease sale, a sale they continued to work on even during the shutdown. For the time being, this will help preserve our beloved Chaco Canyon from oil and gas development and protect cultural sites that this administration has moved forward while ignoring tribal consultation. We still have more work to do. As Vice Chair of the House Committee on Natural Resources, I'm committed to protecting our sacred lands, addressing climate change, and moving renewable energy forward so we can pass our natural treasures down to our children. Last week, I introduced my first bill, the Antiquities Act of 2019. This bill, I have 79 co-sponsors for that bill. Yes. This bill reinforces the clear intent that only Congress has the authority to modify a national monument designation and provides continuity in the federal process. I'm also advocating for the expansion of the Bears Ears Monument and supporting environmental justice initiatives to invest in clean energy jobs and infrastructure, to reduce greenhouse gas pollution and promote conservation through healthier environment, thereby reducing our carbon footprint. The federal government has also created a new reservation, further isolating Indian country and propelling us further into silence. This is the modern digital reservation, the lack of broadband for tribes in rural communities across our country. It's an injustice that hinders every facet of modern life, including access to education. In Indian country, where it's not uncommon for communities to have unemployment rates of up to 40%, isolation and poverty run rampant, and lack of broadband further disenfranchises entire communities. Currently, less than 10% of homes have broadband services, which is lower than the rate of developing countries. In 2009, the USDA reported that rural communities with greater broadband access had greater economic growth, which directly impacts the ability to gain access to education, apply for jobs, reach public safety services, and general communication. Finding a solution to these digital reservations is a top priority of mine and a necessity for Indian country in every rural community. Generally, we must continue to encourage people to exercise their voices through the ballot box and encourage folks to run for elected positions where many have remained underrepresented and unheard. Local school boards, city councils, county commissions, and state legislatures. And this also means Native women. The real narrative of Native women cannot be minimized. They are woven with resiliency and strength, like Pocahontas, the Powhatan girl who survived abduction and rape at 12 years old but bridged diplomatic relations between England and her tribe. Like Sacagawea, a bilingual Shoshone woman who led the expedition of over 7,500 miles across the United States on foot, carrying her newborn baby. Like Ruth Buffalo, a citizen of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation, who became the first Native American Democratic woman elected to the North Dakota legislature. Like LaDonna Harris, a Comanche national leader who reshaped worldviews of our people through social activism and, among many accomplishments, helped Menominee gain federal recognition. Like Peggy Flanagan, a member of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe, who recently became Lieutenant Governor of Minnesota and the highest-ranking Native woman elected to executive office in the history of the United States. And of course, my dear friend and sister, Sharice Davids, a Ho-Chunk MMA fighter who recently became the first LGBTQ Native American member of Congress. These are the real stories of our Native people, narrated by us. My promise to you is that I will work hard to carry our voices in Congress to help weave a promising future for all of Indian country so that we are no longer hidden in plain view. My hope for you is that no matter where you are or what is going on in your life, that you can create beauty as long as you always remember that every day is a good day to be Indigenous. Thank you all so much. Thank you. Thank you.
So I have a gift for the Congresswoman, and during the campaign, we heard that we have never heard a voice like you, and watching today, it's evidence you have a very strong voice for Indian country, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, thank you. Appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Okay, so at this time, we would like to welcome questions from the press in the studio audience. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and the press first, and staff will bring you a handheld microphone. Please make sure to state your name and who you represent. So we'll start with the press first. Okay, we have one right over here, and it's Levi. State your name and who you represent.
I'm Levi Rickert with Native News Online. This question is directed to President Keel. With the children at the border, many in cages, two indigenous people or children have died in recent months. What is NCAI doing to address this issue of indigenous children at the border?
Thank you for that question. It is an important question. As I have alluded to, it hasn't been that long ago that our people, our children, were torn from their families, from their mothers, and placed in boarding schools across the country. Many of those children were never reunited. Some of them died in what we call captivity. They were forced to be in boarding school. Go to Carlisle Indian School, for example. There's a cemetery there with a lot of graves. Some of those tribes have begun some repatriation for those children. Others have not. But specifically, those at our southern border, we've worked. There's a coalition that is taking place right now that's being formed. There's a lot of Native women, particularly in California, that are working to gather clothes, food, and other items that we can take and to support those families that are there. NCAI is working closely with our allies to develop some type of policy update and get Congress support. We're going to work with Congresswoman Holland to help us with that, to develop a strategy to go and help. But the bottom line is that we're limited like everyone else. This is an administration's administrative decision that can change any time. It's unfortunate. In fact, it's not just unfortunate. It's worse than that. It's a manufactured crisis that we have at our border. So we're working very hard to find out what we can do to help those families, not only with supplies and equipment, but some sort of policy dialogue that we can enter into with Congress to get them to act.
Thank you. Also, the president did a statement when the detention first occurred, and then more recently as well, so our voice is heard in Indian country. Okay, other media. I have to give fidelity to our media, so we'll go there first. We have one here, and then right over here. Make sure to say your name and who you represent.
Hi, I'm Jen Derenwater. I'm with Truth Out. I'd like to know what NCAI is doing to address the issues of urban missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The Urban Indian Health Institute put out a study recently that found that 94% of Native women in Seattle had been raped or coerced into sex. And the vast majority of the policy that's happening doesn't focus on urban Natives. So what are you all doing about that?
Derek, you want to address that?
Come on up.
I'm going to ask one of our legal experts that's working very closely with this. We do have a coalition, a task force, a VAWA task force that works very closely with those. In fact, one of our vice president, or the secretary, Juana Mahal-Dixon, is very close to that and works very hard on that. And she's at a meeting right now working to help develop some policies and strategies for that. You want to add something, Virginia?
Yeah, I would just say that it's on the task force agenda today. That'll be happening this afternoon. They'll be discussing the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. We've also been working on Savannah's Act and working in partnership with the Urban Indian Health Institute and others to make sure that the language that's included in that legislation is inclusive of Native women, whether they're on the reservation or in urban areas, recognizing the extent of the problem in the urban areas as well.
We have limited time. Right here.
Yeah, hello? Oh, Vincent Schilling, Indian Country Today. I'm just curious, we come from the Obama administration, which used to have the White House Tribal Nations Conference that we don't see anymore, obviously. And now we have this administration. Of course, we have two congresswomen that are Native. What is the political climate or the receptivity of the two administrations, how it used to be and how it is now? How are things received in Indian Country? Just curious.
Well, in terms of how it's perceived in Indian Country, well, the fact is that we've not had dialogue with this president. We've not had a meeting with President Trump yet. But we are meeting this afternoon. I'm meeting, and this week I'll be meeting with some White House representatives to see if we can't reestablish that tradition, the practice that was started by President Obama. Part of what I see and the perception is that this administration has basically its priorities are elsewhere, and I don't see it as a priority. We're trying to reestablish that. I think we started off on a pretty good foot, but then things just never got traction. We were told at one time in the first year that there probably was going to be a summit, and it never materialized. The date kept moving, and finally it just dropped. So we're trying very hard to reestablish that. We hope that we can get with President Obama and we hope that we can get with President Trump to reestablish President Obama's tradition of having that summit. That was just a slip, President Trump. You know, thank you.
We have time for one more question. Then I will defer to Mr. Garcia for our last question or comment.
Yeah, Mr. President, you know about the Joe Garcia from Okewinge. Joe Garcia, councilman from Okewinge. The FAST Act was passed in 2015, December. A NAGREG team was established to provide the rules and regs for a self-governance program to be effective in Indian Country with the Department of Transportation federal highway programs. Now, we set wheels in motion, and we now have hit the wall, literally the wall. The wall meaning that we have no action, especially now with the closure of the federal government. We have not proposed the rules and regs because of the federal team. It's a partnership, federal team, tribal team, and so we've been struggling for the past 2.5 years, going on 3 years now. Act should have already been proposed. The rules and regs should have been proposed December of 2017. Here we are. February of 2019, and it's been the administrative faults and delays that have caused all of what we're seeing right now. So what can we do to continue to promote, finish that product for the benefit of Tribal Nation?
Well, I think you just explained it, that it's not our decision. We do want to work with the Department of Transportation and the federal agencies to make sure that we get those talks reinstated, to recontinue those and continue that dialogue. When you said that we hit the wall, I thought you were talking about the southern border.
Okay, Thank you for coming. If you didn't get a chance to ask your questions, we still invite you to go to our website, www.ncai.org, and provide your question, and we will have somebody respond to you. We want to thank you for attending our 2019 State of Indian Nations, and remember, every day is a great day to be Indigenous. Miigwech.